The dump stretched endlessly, a wasteland of decay on the edge of the city. Here, the air was thick with the smell of rotting garbage. Flies buzzed relentlessly around heaps of discarded food, shattered glass, and rusted metal. It was a place no one wanted to see, a place where the city's forgotten castaways were left to fend for themselves. For 3 boys, this dump wasn't just a garbage heap, it was their home. Isaiah, at 14, was the oldest. His frame was lean, his face hardened by a life far too cruel for someone his age. Dirt streaked his cheeks, but his dark eyes remained sharp and alert. As he walked over the uneven piles of waste, he glanced back at the 2 younger boys who trailed behind him. "Tyrone, watch where you're stepping," Isaiah called out, his voice low but firm. Tyrone, 12 years old and bursting with energy, ignored the warning. "I'm fine, Isaiah," he said, hopping over a broken piece of wood. He wore a wide grin, but there was a defiance in his tone, masking the fear he often felt. Behind them, Malik, the youngest at 11, stumbled on the uneven ground. He had always been timid, clinging to Isaiah like a younger brother seeking protection. "I'm trying," Malik muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind sweeping through the trash. The 3 boys had lived at the dump for months, scraping together a meager existence by scavenging through the city's discarded remnants. Each piece of scrap metal, each rusted can, was a lifeline, a way to buy stale bread or an occasional piece of fruit from the street vendors who avoided the dump like the plague. Isaiah had once lived in a small apartment with his mother, a kind woman with a soft laugh. But after she passed away in a car accident, Isaiah was shuffled between foster homes. He eventually ran away, unable to endure the neglect. Tyrone's story was similar. His mother had left when he was young, and his father's anger had driven him to the streets. Malik barely remembered his parents. All he knew was that one day, they were gone, and he was left alone. Isaiah stopped and crouched down beside a pile of trash, motioning for the others to join him. "Here," he said, pulling a bent piece of copper wire from the debris. "This'll get us a few coins." Tyrone snorted. "A few coins won't buy us dinner." "We'll find more," Isaiah replied, his tone steady. He always tried to keep Tyrone calm, even when he felt the same frustration bubbling inside himself. As they continued their search, Malik hesitated, his small hands hovering over a broken toy car. He picked it up, staring at it with wide eyes. For a moment, it reminded him of the toys he used to have, back when life was simpler. "Leave it, Malik," Isaiah said gently. "We can't carry anything that doesn't help us." Malik dropped the toy and nodded, his shoulders slumping. The day passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, making the heat unbearable. Sweat clung to their clothes as they worked in silence, the occasional growl of a stomach breaking the quiet. Isaiah glanced up at the sky, his thoughts drifting to memories of his mother. He wondered if, wherever she was, she could see him. He wondered if she'd be proud or heartbroken. By the time the sun began to set, their haul was small. A few scraps of metal, some glass bottles, and a rusted pan. It wasn't enough, but it would have to do. The boys trudged back to the makeshift shelter they'd built out of cardboard and old tarps. As they sat in the dim light of the evening, Tyrone spoke up. "You think anyone even knows we're here? Like, really knows?" Isaiah didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the distant city lights, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Probably not. People don't see us. They don't care." Malik hugged his knees to his chest, his small voice trembling. "Do you think they ever will?" Isaiah looked at him, forcing a small, reassuring smile. "Maybe one day. But for now, we stick together. That's what matters." The 3 boys huddled closer as the cool night air set in. Their shared silence spoke volumes, a mix of fear, hope, and a determination to survive another day. Far away, in the bustling city, their lives were invisible to the world. But they had no idea that soon, everything was about to change. The morning sun crept over the dump, casting long shadows across the heaps of trash. Isaiah was already awake, silently sorting through the few items they collected the day before. Malik stirred nearby, rubbing his eyes as Tyrone stretched and groaned. "Another day, same mess," Tyrone muttered, kicking a stray can. Isaiah didn't respond. He was focused on the task at hand, determined to find something of value before the sun climbed too high and the dump became unbearable. As they worked, the distant sound of a vehicle reached their ears. Isaiah froze, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "Is that?" Malik whispered, his voice trembling. Tyrone squinted. "It's them." A dusty white police car appeared at the edge of the dump, the engine rumbling as it stopped abruptly. Isaiah's heart sank. He recognized the car immediately. Officer Grant and Officer Keller climbed out, their uniforms already stained with dirt from their routine patrols. They weren't there to help. They never were. Grant, the taller of the two, adjusted his belt and smirked. Well, look who we have here," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Isaiah motioned for Malik and Tyrone to stay behind him. "We're not bothering anyone," he said firmly. Grant chuckled, his smirk widening. "This is private property, kid. You know that, don't you?" Keller, shorter but stockier, stepped closer, his eyes cold and calculating. "What are you digging through this trash for? Looking for your dinner?" Tyrone clenched his fists, his temper flaring. "We're not doing anything wrong," he snapped. Grant's smile faded as he turned to Tyrone. "Watch your mouth, boy," he growled. "Unless you want to find out what happens when kids like you get smart." Isaiah shot Tyrone a warning glance. "Don't," he whispered. "Just don't." Grant leaned closer to Isaiah, towering over him. "You're the smart one, huh? The leader?" He pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket and held it out mockingly. "Here, maybe this'll buy you a clue." Isaiah stared at the money, his jaw tightening. Every fiber of his being screamed to reject it, but survival was a cruel master. Slowly, he reached out and took the bill, his fingers trembling. "See? That wasn't so hard," Grant said with a laugh, turning to Keller. "These kids know their place." Keller snickered, crossing his arms. "Yeah, they know better than to cause trouble." For a moment, the boys stood in silence, their faces burning with humiliation. Malik looked down, his small hands gripping his shirt tightly. Tyrone glared at the officers, his anger barely contained. Isaiah kept his head high, but the shame in his eyes was unmistakable. "All right," Grant said, clapping his hands together. "Let's see how strong you really are. Lift that." He pointed to a large wooden beam lying nearby, its surface splintered and rough. "What?" Isaiah asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You heard me," Grant replied. "Pick it up. All of you." Isaiah hesitated, but knew they had no choice. He nodded at Tyrone and Malik, who reluctantly followed his lead. Together, the boys crouched beside the beam, their small hands gripping its edges. "On three," Isaiah said, his voice steady despite the fear. 1, 2, 3. They heaved with all their might, but the beam barely moved. It was too heavy, the weight crushing against their shoulders as they struggled to lift it. Grant and Keller laughed, their voices echoing across the dump. "Pathetic," Keller sneered. Isaiah gritted his teeth, his muscles straining. He could feel Malik's knees buckling beside him, and Tyrone's labored breathing filled the air. "Keep going," Grant barked. The boys pushed themselves to their limits, the pain searing through their bodies. Just as Isaiah thought he couldn't take any more, the beam slipped from their grasp and thudded to the ground. Exhausted, the boys collapsed beside it, gasping for air. Grant and Keller stood over them, their faces filled with contempt. "Looks like you're not as tough as you think," Grant said. Keller added, "Better remember that next time we come around." Isaiah glared at them, his chest heaving. He wanted to speak, to fight back, but he knew it would only make things worse. The officers finally turned to leave, their laughter fading as they walked back to their car. As the engine roared to life and the car disappeared into the distance, the boys lay in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing down on them. Isaiah sat up slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. "We're okay," he said, though his voice was hoarse. "We'll get through this." Malik hugged his knees, his small body trembling. "Why do they hate us?" Tyrone punched the ground in frustration. "Because they can," he muttered bitterly. Isaiah placed a hand on Tyrone's shoulder, trying to steady him. "We'll figure this out," he said, though the doubt in his voice was clear. Far away, hidden behind an old pile of metal scraps, Jacob had seen everything. His camera was still recording, capturing the boy's pain and the officer's cruelty. As he turned off the camera, Jacob's hands shook. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of it terrified him. This wasn't just a story. This was a call for justice, and he couldn't ignore it. Jacob sat in his small apartment later that evening, the glow of his laptop illuminating the dimly lit room. The footage he'd recorded at the dump played on the screen. Every second of it weighed heavily on him. The boy's fear, the officer's mockery, the raw and humiliating power imbalance. He paused the video and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his messy hair. The journalist in him knew the story was explosive. It was the kind of expose that could grab national attention, maybe even force the city to confront its darkest truths. But the man in him, the part that had seen the system grind people down, was hesitant. He'd seen it before. Whistleblowers targeted, victims silenced, stories buried. What if exposing this made things worse for those boys? What if the backlash hit them harder than it hit the officers? Jacob sighed, glancing at the notepad on his desk. It was filled with scribbles about the boys, their vulnerability, and the broader issue of neglect in the city's poorest corners. He tapped his pen against the desk, his mind swirling with doubts. He couldn't just do nothing. The next morning, Jacob returned to the dump. He parked his old sedan a distance away, careful not to draw attention. As he walked toward the sprawling wasteland, he saw the three boys sitting by a pile of garbage. They were quiet, their movements slow, as though the weight of yesterday's encounter still clung to them. "Hey," Jacob called out gently as he approached. Isaiah's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" he asked, stepping protectively in front of Tyrone and Malik. Jacob raised his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm Jacob. I'm a journalist." Tyrone scoffed. "A journalist? What do you want with us?" Jacob stopped a few feet away, kneeling slightly to meet their eye level. "I saw what happened yesterday, with the officers. I filmed it." Isaiah's expression hardened. "Why?" Jacob hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because people need to know. What they did to you was wrong, and the world needs to see it." Malik peeked out from behind Isaiah, his voice soft. "What happens if they find out you filmed it?" "They won't," Jacob said firmly. "Not unless you want me to share it. I won't do anything without your permission." Isaiah studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes filled with suspicion. "And what happens to us if you do? What if it just makes them angrier?" Jacob's chest tightened. He couldn't deny the risk. "That's why I'm here," he said. "I want to help. I don't just want to show people what's happening. I want to make sure you're protected." Tyrone crossed his arms, his voice sharp. "Protected? By who? Nobody cares about us. They never have." Jacob frowned. "You're wrong," he said. "I care. And if we tell your story, I believe others will too." Isaiah glanced at Tyrone and Malik, their expressions uncertain. Finally, he nodded. "We'll talk to you. But you can't show our faces. We don't want anyone knowing it's us." "Deal," Jacob agreed quickly. Over the next hour, the boys shared pieces of their lives. Isaiah spoke about his mother and how he ended up at the dump. Tyrone vented about the anger he carried, his frustration at a world that turned its back on kids like him. Malik didn't say much, but when he did, his words cut to the heart of the matter. "We don't want to be here," he said softly, staring at the ground. "We just don't have anywhere else to go." Jacob listened intently, his heart breaking with every detail. He realized how much strength it took for these boys to trust him, even a little. Before leaving, he handed Isaiah a small bag of snacks and bottled water. "It's not much," he said, "but it's something." Isaiah hesitated, then took the bag. "Thanks," he said gruffly. As Jacob walked back to his car, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a responsibility now, not just to tell their story, but to make sure it led to real change. That night, Jacob uploaded the footage to his social media account, carefully editing it to blur the boys' faces. He added captions explaining the context, how these children were surviving on the margins of society, exploited and abused by those sworn to protect them. As he hit post, his heart pounded. Would anyone care? Would anyone even see it? Within hours, the video began to spread. Comments flooded in, ranging from shock and outrage to heartbreak and disbelief. "How can this happen in our city?" one user wrote. "Those boys need help now," another commented. "This is what happens when no one is watching. Thank you for exposing this." By morning, the video had gone viral. Local news outlets picked it up, and soon national networks were calling Jacob for interviews. The hashtag Justice for the Forgotten began trending, and people from all over the country demanded answers. At the dump, Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik noticed the difference immediately. Strangers began arriving, offering food, clothes, and blankets. At first, the boys were wary, unsure if these people could be trusted. Then Jacob returned, his face lit with hope. "The video worked," he told them. "People are listening. They want to help." Isaiah crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "What about the cops? You think they're just gonna let this slide?" Jacob's smile faltered. "They're under investigation now. But yeah, they might push back. That's why we need to be careful." Tyrone looked at him skeptically. "Careful? What does that even mean?" "It means," Jacob said, kneeling again, "that this isn't over. But you're not alone anymore. People see you now. They care. And I won't stop fighting for you." For the first time, a glimmer of hope flickered in Isaiah's eyes. He didn't fully trust Jacob, not yet, but the idea that someone cared enough to fight for them was enough to keep him going. As they watched Jacob leave, Tyrone muttered, "You think he's for real?" Isaiah didn't answer right away. He turned to Malik, who was clutching the water bottle Jacob had given him like it was a treasure. "I don't know," Isaiah admitted, "but we'll find out." For the first time in months, they felt something different, something fragile but undeniable. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Jacob's video had become a nationwide phenomenon. The footage of the boys' humiliation at the dump, coupled with Jacob's careful narration, had struck a chord. People from all walks of life were sharing the video, demanding action. At the boys' makeshift shelter, Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik noticed the stir before Jacob arrived. Cars they didn't recognize idled near the edge of the dump, their occupants watching with a mix of curiosity and concern. Isaiah narrowed his eyes, his instincts warning him to stay cautious. "Why are there so many people here?" Malik clung to his side, his small voice trembling. "Are they here to hurt us?" Tyrone folded his arms, his expression a mix of defiance and unease. "Let them try." Before Isaiah could answer, Jacob's car pulled up. He stepped out, holding a bag of groceries in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. His face lit with relief when he saw the boys. "Good, you're all okay," he said, walking quickly toward them. "What's going on?" Isaiah asked, his tone cautious. Jacob set the bag down and handed Isaiah one of the papers. It was a printed-out screenshot of a news article. The headline read, "Footage of police abusing homeless boys sparks nationwide outrage." "It's everywhere," Jacob said. "The video's gone viral. People are demanding answers, and the city's already launched an investigation into the officers." Tyrone grabbed the paper from Isaiah's hands, scanning it with wide eyes. "So, people actually care?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They do," Jacob said firmly, "and they want to help." As the day wore on, volunteers arrived at the dump with food, water, and supplies. A woman from a local charity approached the boys with cautious warmth, handing Malik a clean blanket. "You're so brave," she said gently. "We're going to make sure you're safe from now on." Malik stared at her, clutching the blanket tightly. He didn't say anything, but the small nod he gave spoke volumes. Isaiah, however, remained guarded. "What's the catch?" he asked Jacob quietly, his voice low enough so the others wouldn't hear. "No catch," Jacob said. "These people just want to help." He hesitated, then added, "But there's going to be pushback. Not everyone is happy about this." "What do you mean?" Isaiah asked, his eyes narrowing. Jacob sighed. "The police department is already trying to discredit the video. They're saying it's out of context, that I edited it to make them look bad. And I've heard rumors that Officers Grant and Keller are trying to intimidate witnesses." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "So they're not going to stop?" No, Jacob admitted, but neither are we. The backlash Jacob predicted began almost immediately. That evening, a press conference was held at the police department. The chief of police, flanked by Grant and Keller, spoke with a calm but dismissive tone. These allegations are unfounded, the chief said. The officers were performing routine patrols. The video lacks context and doesn't show the full story. Jacob watched the conference from his apartment, frustration boiling in his chest. He'd expected this, but hearing it still stung. The boys, meanwhile, watched the same broadcast at the shelter provided by the charity. Tyrone nearly threw the remote at the screen. Lacks context? He shouted. They were laughing at us. How's that out of context? Isaiah sat quietly, his face unreadable. Malik sat beside him, clutching his blanket tightly. What do we do now? Malik whispered. Isaiah looked at him, then at Tyrone. We tell the truth. That's all we can do. The next day, Jacob arranged for a local civil rights attorney, Monica Rivera, to meet with the boys. She was sharp and confident, her presence commanding the room. I've reviewed the footage, Monica said, sitting across from the boys in the shelter's small common area. It's powerful. But if we're going to hold these officers accountable, we need your voices too. Isaiah frowned. You mean we have to talk about it? In front of people? Yes, Monica said gently. In court. It won't be easy, but your testimony could make all the difference. Tyrone hesitated, his usual bravado faltering. What if they come after us? They won't, Monica said firmly. The city is already under a microscope because of this. They can't afford to retaliate. And I'll make sure you're protected. Isaiah looked at her, his expression conflicted. He hated the idea of reliving what had happened, but he knew she was right. Okay, he said finally. We'll do it. The public support for the boys grew stronger as news outlets continued to cover the story. The hashtag Justice for the Forgotten was trending worldwide, and donations poured into the charity supporting them. But the boys knew this was only the beginning. One evening, as they sat together in their small room at the shelter, Tyrone turned to Isaiah. You think it'll change anything? What we're doing? Isaiah stared out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. I don't know, he admitted, but it's more than we've ever had before. And that has to mean something. Malik, curled up on the bed with his new blanket, spoke softly. It means people see us now. They didn't before. For the first time in years, the boys felt something new. It wasn't just hope. It was a glimmer of possibility. The courtroom was quiet, its air heavy with anticipation. Isaiah sat on the hard wooden bench beside Tyrone and Malik, their attorney, Monica Rivera, sitting to their left. The boys wore donated dress shirts, but they still felt out of place among the clean, polished surroundings. Remember, Monica said softly, leaning toward them, tell the truth, and don't let them intimidate you. You've already done the hardest part by being here. Isaiah nodded, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Beside him, Tyrone stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, while Malik fidgeted nervously, his small fingers pulling at the hem of his shirt. At the front of the room sat officers Grant and Keller, flanked by their defense attorneys. Grant's smirk had disappeared, replaced by a stiff, unreadable expression. Keller, on the other hand, avoided eye contact with anyone, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, entered the courtroom. Everyone rose as she took her seat. This court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Monica opened the case with a clear, concise argument. She laid out the boys' lives, the abandonment, the struggle for survival, and the abuse they endured at the hands of the officers. Then she played Jacob's video for the court. As the footage filled the room, a hush fell over the spectators. The sound of the boys' labored breathing, the officers' mocking laughter, and the weight of the beam crashing to the ground echoed through the silent courtroom. Monica let the video play to the end before turning to the jury. This is not just about these three boys, she said firmly. This is about a system that allows those in power to exploit the vulnerable. These officers were not upholding the law, they were breaking it. The defense attorneys quickly pushed back, attempting to paint the officers as victims of a misrepresented situation. They were simply trying to maintain order, one of the attorneys argued. The boys were trespassing on private property, and the officers acted within their rights. Isaiah felt anger bubbling inside him as he listened, but Monica's reassuring glance kept him grounded. When it was time for the boys to testify, Isaiah went first. He walked to the stand with steady steps, his heart pounding but his face calm. Monica approached him, her tone gentle but firm. "Isaiah," she began, "can you tell the court what happened the day Officers Grant and Keller confronted you and your friends?" Isaiah took a deep breath. "We were at the dump, like we are every day, looking for scraps to sell. The officers came in their car. They yelled at us, called us names. They made us lift a big wooden beam for no reason, just to humiliate us." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "We didn't do anything to them. We just wanted to survive." Monica nodded, stepping closer. "And how did that make you feel?" Isaiah's jaw tightened. "It made me feel powerless, like we didn't matter." The defense attorney stood next, his questions sharp and deliberate. "Isaiah, you mentioned that you were trespassing on private property. Were you aware of that at the time?" Isaiah hesitated, then answered, "We knew it wasn't ours, but we didn't have anywhere else to go." The attorney pounced. "So you admit you were breaking the law?" Monica immediately objected, her voice firm. "The boys' actions do not excuse the abuse they endured." "Objection sustained," the judge said, her tone sharp. Tyrone's testimony was more heated. He couldn't mask his frustration as he recounted the events. "They didn't care about the law," he said, glaring at Grant. "They just wanted to mess with us because they could." Monica had to guide him back several times, her calm voice helping him focus. Malik, the youngest, barely spoke above a whisper when it was his turn, but his quiet words carried the most weight. "They made us feel like garbage," he said, his small hands gripping the edge of the stand, "like we didn't matter." Throughout the trial, Jacob and Monica worked tirelessly to present additional evidence. Jacob provided more footage, including clips of other community members recounting similar abuse by the same officers. Monica called witnesses who testified to the boys' character and the systemic neglect they'd endured. The defense attempted to discredit the boys, insinuating they were troublemakers who didn't respect authority. But Monica was relentless, dismantling their arguments piece by piece. By the time closing arguments arrived, the mood in the courtroom was tense but hopeful. Monica addressed the jury with conviction. "These boys are not invisible. They are not disposable. They are children who were failed by the system and then targeted by the very people sworn to protect them. Today, you have the power to say that enough is enough." After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Officers Grant and Keller, guilty on all counts." The room erupted into whispers, and Monica allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Grant's face twisted in anger, while Keller slumped in his seat, defeated. Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik sat frozen for a moment, the words sinking in. Then Malik whispered, "We won." Isaiah nodded slowly, a rare smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, we won." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. When the boys emerged, cheers erupted. Signs reading #JusticeForTheForgotten waved in the air. People rushed to congratulate them, offering words of encouragement and support. Jacob stood off to the side, filming the moment. When Isaiah saw him, he walked over and extended his hand. "Thank you," Isaiah said simply. Jacob shook his hand, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the brave ones. I just told the world what you showed me." As the boys stood before the crowd, Isaiah realized something profound. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were symbols of hope and change. For the first time, they felt seen, truly seen. And for the first time, they believed that their voices could make a difference. The courtroom victory marked the beginning of a new chapter for Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik. The weight of their struggles hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. For the first time in their lives, they weren't alone. Local organizations and charities, inspired by the boys' courage, came forward to help. Within days, the boys were moved from the dump to a modest but clean apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it was safe. and for 3 boys who had grown used to the constant uncertainty of survival, it was a haven. As they stepped into their new home, Malik ran his fingers along the walls, his eyes wide. "We have beds," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Tyrone flopped onto the couch, letting out a dramatic sigh. "I could get used to this." Isaiah stood in the doorway, taking it all in. He didn't smile, not yet. He was still waiting for the catch, for the moment when it all came crashing down. But deep down, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. Their days began to change in ways they hadn't imagined. The boys were enrolled in a nearby school, each given backpacks filled with supplies donated by local families. At first, the idea of school terrified them. "What if we don't fit in?" Malik asked one evening, his voice trembling. Isaiah knelt beside him, his hand firm on Malik's shoulder. "We stick together," he said, "like we always have." Tyrone, however, was skeptical. "What if the other kids think we're just the dump boys?" "Then we prove them wrong," Isaiah said, his tone resolute. The transition wasn't easy. On their first day, the boys sat at the back of the classroom, avoiding eye contact. Some of the other students whispered and pointed, their curiosity palpable. But over time, things began to shift. Tyrone discovered a knack for art, pouring his emotions onto paper in vivid, expressive drawings that caught the attention of his teacher. Malik, quiet but determined, excelled in reading and math, his confidence growing with each small success. Isaiah found himself stepping into a leadership role, helping both his brothers and his classmates navigate challenges. Teachers noticed his natural ability to lead and encouraged him to join the student council. At first, he resisted. "I'm not like them," he told Jacob during one of their regular check-ins. "They don't know what it's like to fight for every scrap." Jacob smiled. "That's exactly why you should do it. You've got a perspective they need to hear." Meanwhile, Jacob's work didn't stop with the trial. Inspired by the boys, he launched a new project, Voices in the Shadows, a documentary series highlighting the lives of people who had been overlooked and mistreated. The first episode, centered on Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik, went viral almost immediately. In one scene, Isaiah sat on the edge of his bed, speaking directly to the camera. "We thought no one cared," he said, his voice steady but raw with emotion. "We thought we didn't matter. But now we know we do. And we're not going to stop fighting for kids like us." The series sparked a wave of activism. Donations poured into local shelters and advocacy groups, and city officials faced increasing pressure to reform the systems that had failed the boys. One evening, as the boys sat in their small living room, they talked about the future, something they had never dared to dream about before. "I want to be a teacher," Malik said shyly, his fingers tracing patterns on his notebook. "I want to help kids like us learn, so they don't have to feel so scared." Tyrone leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. "I'm gonna be an artist. Paintings, murals, maybe even cartoons. People will know my name." Isaiah smiled at his brothers, a rare moment of pride lighting his face. "Those are good dreams," he said quietly. "What about you?" Malik asked, looking up at him. Isaiah hesitated, staring out the window at the city lights. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But whatever it is, I want to make sure no one has to go through what we did." The boys' story continued to inspire people far beyond their city. News outlets featured updates on their progress, and local leaders praised their resilience. But the boys knew the real work was just beginning. Isaiah, true to his word, began speaking at community events, advocating for better protections for vulnerable children. He worked closely with Jacob and Monica Rivera to push for policy changes, focusing on housing, education, and police accountability. Tyrone's artwork began gaining attention, his bold, emotional pieces displayed at local galleries. Malik, with his quiet determination, started tutoring younger children at a nearby community center, sharing his love of learning. One night, as they sat together in their apartment, Tyrone turned to Isaiah. "You think all of this, everything that's happened, you think it's really going to make a difference?" Isaiah looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "It already has," he said, "but we've got a long way to go." Malik nodded, his small voice steady. "As long as we stick together, we'll be okay." Isaiah smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, he believed his little brother's words. Together, they were building something new, something stronger. And for the first time, their future didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt real. Months had passed since the trial, and the world for Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik had transformed in ways they never thought possible. Their lives, once defined by struggle and survival at the dump, were now filled with possibilities. But the boys were not content to simply live in their newfound comfort. They felt a calling, a need to give back and ensure others like them wouldn't suffer the way they had. Isaiah had stepped into his role as an advocate with purpose. Dressed in clean, secondhand shirts that Monica had helped him pick out, he spoke at community events, schools, and even city council meetings. His voice, once silenced by fear, now carried a quiet strength. "I used to think people didn't see us," he said during one event, standing before a crowd of activists and local leaders. "But now I know they do. It's just that sometimes they don't know what to do. That's why we're here, to remind them that every kid deserves a chance." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Isaiah didn't feel overwhelmed by the attention. He felt proud. Tyrone's artistic talent flourished. With the help of a local art program, he had started painting murals across the city, vivid, colorful images that told the story of resilience and hope. One mural, painted on the side of a community center, depicted 3 boys standing together in a field of light, their shadows stretching behind them like echoes of their past. "It's us," Malik had said softly when he saw it for the first time, his eyes wide with wonder. "Yeah," Tyrone replied, a rare smile on his face. "But it's also everyone who's ever felt forgotten." Tyrone's work drew attention from local galleries and even a few national art publications. But for him, the greatest satisfaction came from the kids in the neighborhood who stopped to watch him paint, their eyes wide with inspiration. Malik, shy but determined, had found his own way to make a difference. He spent his afternoons at a nearby community center, tutoring younger kids who struggled with reading and math. One day, as he sat with a little boy who was having trouble with his alphabet, Malik leaned down and said, "It's okay to not know everything right away. Just keep trying. That's what I did." The boy looked up at him, his face breaking into a small smile. "You're really smart," he said. Malik blushed but smiled back. "I wasn't always, but I had people who helped me, and now I want to help you." Jacob, who had remained a constant presence in their lives, was hard at work on Voices in the Shadows. The documentary series had taken off, with each episode highlighting a new story of resilience and systemic change. Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik appeared in the first episode as narrators, sharing their insights and experiences. "People think that kids like us are invisible," Isaiah said in one poignant scene. "But we're not. We're just waiting for someone to see us." The series sparked conversations across the country, leading to policy reforms and increased funding for programs supporting homeless and vulnerable youth. One day, Jacob visited the boys at their apartment, bringing news. "You won't believe this," he said, grinning as he pulled out a letter. "The mayor's office wants to meet with you 3. Tyrone raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "They want your input on a new initiative to help kids living on the streets," Jacob explained. "They've been inspired by your story." Malik's eyes widened. "They want to listen to us?" "Of course they do," Jacob said. "Your voices matter. They always have." The meeting at City Hall was a surreal experience. Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik sat across from city officials, their input taken seriously for the first time in their lives. Isaiah spoke with confidence. "It's not just about housing," he said. "It's about making sure kids feel safe and supported. That's what we needed, and that's what they need too." By the end of the meeting, the officials were nodding in agreement. A few weeks later, the city announced a new program called the Bright Futures Initiative, designed to provide housing, education, and counseling for homeless youth. Despite their growing responsibilities, the boys always made time for each other. One evening, as they sat on the couch eating pizza, a rare treat provided by Jacob, Tyrone glanced at Isaiah. "You ever think about where we were a year ago?" he asked. Isaiah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Every day." Malik looked up from his plate. "It feels like a different life." "It was," Isaiah said. But we're still the same. We've just grown. Tyrone smirked. Speak for yourself. I'm way cooler now. Malik laughed, and even Isaiah cracked a smile. For the first time, their laughter wasn't tinged with bitterness or fear. It was pure and genuine, a reflection of how far they'd come. As the night wore on, the boys talked about their dreams. I'm gonna keep painting, Tyrone said. Big murals, bigger than the ones I'm doing now. I want people to see them and feel something. I want to teach, Malik said, his voice steady. I want to help kids who feel like I used to feel. Isaiah leaned back, a rare look of contentment on his face. I want to fight, he said. Not with my fists, but with my voice. I want to make sure no kid ever feels like we did. Jacob, sitting nearby, watched them with quiet pride. He had started this journey hoping to tell a story, but what he found was something much greater. A family, bound not by blood but by shared pain and hope. And as the boys laughed and talked late into the night, it was clear that their story was far from over. They had turned their pain into purpose, their struggles into strength. Together, they were building a brighter future. Not just for themselves, but for everyone still living in the shadows. A year had passed since the trial, and life for Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik was unrecognizable from their days at the dump. They had become symbols of resilience, inspiring countless others to believe in the possibility of change. But their journey was far from over. Each boy had carved out a unique path, all while remaining deeply connected to one another. Isaiah's mission. Isaiah stood at a podium in a packed auditorium, his voice steady and clear. It was a conference on youth homelessness, attended by policymakers, activists, and educators from across the country. Behind him, a large screen displayed the title, Rebuilding Lives, Rebuilding Systems. Too often, we treat homelessness as a failure of individuals, Isaiah said, his gaze sweeping the room. But it's not. It's a failure of systems, systems that are supposed to protect children like me, Tyrone, and Malik, but instead leave us to fend for ourselves. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. But we're here to change that, Isaiah continued. Not just for us, but for the thousands of kids who are still waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard. We owe it to them to do better. When the audience erupted into applause, Isaiah felt a surge of pride. He had gone from being invisible to standing in front of people who had the power to enact real change. Afterward, a young girl approached him with her mother. Her wide eyes brimmed with hope. Are you really one of the boys from the video? She asked. Isaiah knelt to her level and nodded. Yeah, I am. Her mother smiled tearfully. Because of you, we found help. You saved us. Isaiah's chest tightened, but he smiled warmly. You saved yourselves, he said. You're stronger than you know. Tyrone's canvas. Tyrone's murals had become landmarks in the city. Each one told a story, from the hardship of living on the streets to the joy of finding community and hope. His latest work, painted on the side of an abandoned warehouse, was his most ambitious yet. It depicted 3 children standing at the edge of a dark forest, their faces turned toward a brilliant sunrise. Above them, bold letters read, From the shadows, we rise. As he stepped back to admire his work, a group of neighborhood kids gathered around him. Did you really live in a dump? One boy asked, his eyes wide. Yeah, Tyrone said, setting down his paintbrush. But that's not the important part. The important part is where I am now. And you can get there too. The boy grinned. Can you teach me how to paint? Tyrone laughed. You got it, kid. Just don't mess up my brushes. Malik's classroom. Malik sat at a small desk in the community center, surrounded by a group of children. He was helping them with math, his calm demeanor putting even the most frustrated kids at ease. You're getting it, he said to a boy struggling with multiplication. Just take it step by step. The boy sighed but kept trying. When he finally got the answer right, his face lit up. I did it. Malik smiled. See? I told you you could. After the session ended, one of the kids lingered behind. Mr. Malik, the girl said shyly, I think I want to be a teacher when I grow up, like you. Malik's heart swelled. He crouched to her level. You'd make a great teacher, he said. And when you do, don't forget to help kids like us. Jacob's legacy. Jacob's documentary series, Voices in the Shadows, had expanded into a full-fledged movement. Each episode spotlighted stories of people who had been overlooked by society, from children living on the streets to families struggling with poverty. The series had inspired new laws, increased funding for social programs, and a national conversation about systemic inequality. But Jacob knew the real heroes were Isaiah, Tyrone, and Malik. One evening, as he sat with the boys in their apartment, Jacob shared a letter he had received. "It's from a kid in Ohio," Jacob said. "He says he saw your story and decided to talk to a counselor about the things he's been going through at home. He said you gave him the courage to speak up." Malik's eyes widened. "We did that?" Jacob nodded. "You did. A night to remember." To celebrate a year of progress, the community organized a fundraiser and invited the boys as guests of honor. Held in a brightly lit event hall, the night was filled with speeches, music, and displays of Tyrone's artwork. When it was Isaiah's turn to speak, he looked out at the crowd. He saw Monica, Jacob, and dozens of faces he didn't recognize but who had come to support their cause. "I used to think hope was just a word," he began. "Something people talked about but didn't really mean. But now I know it's real. Because of all of you, hope isn't just a word. It's what we live every day." The applause was deafening, but it was the pride in Tyrone and Malik's eyes that meant the most to him. Looking ahead, as the boys walked home that night, they stopped at the edge of a park to look at the city skyline. "Think we've made a difference?" Tyrone asked, his voice soft. Isaiah nodded. "We've done more than that. We've started something, and we're not done yet." Malik smiled, his small frame glowing with quiet determination. "Together, we can do anything." The three of them stood there for a moment, side by side. The city lights shimmered before them, but the future ahead was even brighter. They had risen from the shadows, carrying with them the voices of countless others who had been silenced. And as long as they could, they would keep fighting. For themselves, for each other, and for everyone still waiting to be seen. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time, they knew exactly where they were going.